T.S. Eliot, as I mentioned in reflection number 1 in Ash Wednesday, made a turn to Christianity in the late 1920s. But his turn to Christianity was a turn to Anglican Christianity, and within that a turn to the Catholic element of Christianity within Anglicanism. There are a variety of elements within that Catholic element of Anglicanism that is very much embodied in Ash Wednesday as well as Eliot's journey itself. Let me just list a few of them, which will help illuminate this part 2 of Ash Wednesday. First of all, in part 1, the notion of the I is articulated 17 times by Eliot, and a part of Catholic Anglicanism as well as the Roman Catholic Church and Orthodoxy is the notion of the confession, is that one goes to a priest or a lay person who they trust, and they share both the best of the longings and some of the dark, the painful, the disappointing elements of their life. They work through those issues over a period of time, and the hope is that they come to greater clearings and light within their soul. And so that confessional element of Ash Wednesday is very important, and we'll see it played out in part 2. The second element is Eliot at this particular period of the late 1920s, as he was coming to Christianity, is his turn to Dante. Dante's Divine Comedy was very important on that, but back of that was Dante's Vita Nuova, in which Beatrice is central. It's an earlier work of varied sonnets by Dante, but Eliot was very taken by that medieval classical tradition of which Dante embodied in a poetic form, in the same way to some degrees Aquinas did in a much more logical, rigorous form. Dante being a poetic theologian, a poetic philosopher, which drew Eliot inevitably to Dante as a form of articulating the journey of faith into greater depth, as well as going through the dark, the difficult, the painful elements of the journey. Another element, of course, certainly coming from Dante, is Beatrice, and Beatrice pointing to Mary. Beatrice was always for Dante this tension between the ideal, the beautiful, the good, the true, the longing for that, and yet the unattainable nature of it, and yet living in the tension between longing and moving towards the goal, and yet imperfectly and often erratically moving in that direction. These three elements are really foundational to Catholic Anglicanism, the work of Dante, which Eliot turned to, the nature of the feminine, in that sense, Beatrice, the confessional part as well. And we'll see this developed in more depth and detail in part 2 of Ash Wednesday. So let me start. He starts with Lady. So we're already, it's like Eliot is making a confession to Lady in terms of the nature of the journey. It's not a priest, in fact. It's Lady, Beatrice, and Beatrice is an icon pointing the way to some degree to Mary. And also Lady represents the one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church as well. So the notion of Lady is operating at a variety of levels. But he moves on 3 white leopards under a juniper tree. Why 3 white leopards? Well, to understand that, we have to go, obviously, to the Divine Comedy of Dante. And as Dante, as a young man, reaches midlife journey, very significant metaphorically here, because many people begin the journey full of idealism, hope, planning, but as they hit midlife stride, some have become very successful in that, but there's an emptiness. There's a sense of achieving much at one level, but a deep restlessness at another level. Others have made decisions in their 20s and 30s that have led them to cul-de-sacs. As it were, their soul has been eaten up. They have not understood the nature of desire, longing, ordering desires and thirsts in a proper way. And so when Dante begins to move out, he inevitably encounters in the dark woods the leopard, the lion, and the she-wolf. His desire is to make an immediate sprint to the New Jerusalem, to what is good and true and beautiful, but that's not the way transformation takes place. In fact, what Dante has to look at, and what Eliot is exploring in this, is those issues within us, those faculties within us, which can go bad, which can we can almost devour ourselves if we're not careful. And what is meant to be an integration of faculties, in fact, become dissembled, begin to fall apart. They turn on one another. Desires compete. So what you have, 3 white leopards, important 3, an important white to pick up here. 3 representing not the Trinity, but the dark side of what seems to be truth. Interesting, white. We're going to see often how in fact, the vices will clothe themselves in the virtues. And so white is often a color of integrity and authenticity, but the virtues and darkness can clothe itself in light as well, as we know, as from Genesis itself. The angel appears in white. It's very attractive. And so this is the deceptive element of how even the best, even the best itself, we can be confused on what that is in our journey. And so the leopards here, the 3 white leopards under a juniper tree, it's in the desert, which is very important to understand, as we'll get into. In the cool of the day, having fed to satiety on my legs. So why legs? Well, legs are obviously that element that moves us to places of what we think is important, but they can often be places that betray us. It's where we decide to make decisions on elements of life we think are going to give meaning and purpose, but we can often walk to those places which in fact undermine our very sense of purpose. So they've been eating my legs and my heart. Heart is the place of the affections, where our longings, the affections turn to in the hope of fulfillment, of meaning, of purpose, but we can often turn to the wrong places in that quest for that. My liver, in classical medieval thought, the liver is the metaphor of discernment and insight, and actually deeper levels of making decisions. And so you have the leopard, in fact, devouring, or the false self in us, which devours these goods and hence leaves us somewhat undermined, weakened, in a state of what we would call in the Christian tradition a dark night, a cloud of unknowing, a sense of being deserted by God. And then he says, that which have been contained in the hollow round of my skull, so the mind itself. The mind questing to know what is good and true, but if it's improperly oriented, in fact, the leopard can devour it. And so these faculties of legs, liver, heart, and mind, if not guided by something deeper, in fact, the leopard of the false self will consume them. And this was part of Dante's journey. He had to face into those elements of the misuse of his faculties that took him to the dark wood at his midlife journey. And so out of that, the nature then is despair, cynicism. Where do I go from here? Is there any clearings, any possibilities to get out of the dark wood? Obviously, there's not an immediate reaching of the New Jerusalem, a reaching of the Paradiso. He's in the Inferno, essentially, and burning. His soul is not what it could be. He's made decisions that have left to a place in which he's totally out of touch with himself. And out of this, the question comes in God. And God said, shall these bones live? Questioning, shall these bones live? Of course, that's taken right from Ezekiel. And Ezekiel's asking these questions about dry bones in the desert. Can they possibly live? And out of that is the resurrection motif of the bones come together, flesh is put on the soul, and in fact life begins to emerge. So in these 2 parts, on the one hand, you have the desert of emptiness, the dryness, the flatness, the seemingly lack of any meaningful direction of depth. And yet the cry, can these bones be put back together? Can flesh come on them? Is there resurrection in any small way as we move from the Inferno through the Purgatorio? And so he says, and that which had been contained in the bones, which were already died, said chirping. So there's life in the bones. Even though everything seems to be dead, seems to be no life, in fact, at the deepest part of what it means to be human is the image and likeness of God, which like a diamond can never be destroyed. And these bones, as he says, they're chirping because why? Because of the goodness of the lady, and we're back to Beatrice again. So there is often in theology the notion that only Christ or the Spirit mediates grace to people, but within the Catholic tradition, you also have the notion in the creeds, we believe in the communion of the saints, or in the book of Hebrews itself, the great host of witnesses that constantly moderating and mediating grace. And so what Eliot is saying here, it's the goodness of the lady, in fact. She mediates divine grace to people if we have but the stillness and the eyes to see. And because of her lovingness, and because she honors the Virgin in meditation. So we go back in this sense to part 1, where Eliot talks about teach us to sit still. So the meditative way of the lady evokes, calls forth, summons within all of us the visit to her, who then leads, as Beatrice will, to meditation. And it's she who leads Dante, after Virgil, to the next levels of the human journey of transformation. She honors the Virgin in meditation, and we shine with brightness. So what you have is, because of her and her life and her light, the divine image shines again with brightness. And then he returns to himself, and I, who am here dissembled. So he's pulled apart what Dante is doing here via Eliot as well, is there is dissembling that can take place where desires collide, where longings compete with one another, and there leads to a dissembling of who is the I amidst all these possibilities that we could possibly take in the future. But I, who am here dissembled, proffer my deeds to oblivion. So out of that there is still possible good, and out of this what you have is the poet offering what is left of the good within him to oblivion, and my love to the posterity of the desert, in which, of course, the desert is the place of emptiness, it's dryness. So who's going to take the givenness? There's nobody there. Who cares in any meaningful sense? But still you give it away, not sure the results of the giving away, and to the fruit of the gourd. It is this which recovers my guts, the strings of my eyes, and the indigestible portions, which the lepers reject. So the leopard of our false self, which will often symbolize as well the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life, it cannot touch that deep inner core which is divine, that bears the image and likeness of God. It can't consume, it can't digest that, and that's what the leopard can't do. And the lady is withdrawn in a white gown to contemplation, in a white gown. Let the whiteness of bones stone to forgiveness. Now here you have white again. This is the true whiteness in comparison. You're at 3 again. So you have the 3 leopards and you have the 3 whiteness of the lady. This is the true whiteness, the true integrity, the true authenticity that Eliot is pointing to. But it's only mediated through Our Lady, through Beatrice, Beatitudes, beatific vision. And so the task then, what Eliot is articulating, is do be sensitive to the most genuine place through which the true self is transformed, deified, and beware of the counterfeits, which is the leopard, which appears as white, which appears attractive, which appears on the one hand, as Hamlet would say, seems, but is in fact not the true embodiment of the white. So 3 and 3 leopards, 3 white in ladies. So beware of the deceptions, the way vice will wear the garments of virtue, and then what happens when people naively get taken in by that. So the lady is withdrawn into white gown in contemplation. So meditation, contemplation, teach us to sit still. These are means by which Eliot is pointing, in fact, to the way forward, to the deeper self, the eternal self, in a white ground, and at the whiteness of bones, atone to forgetfulness. So where we have forgotten who we're meant to be. So in fact, let the lady guide us in this. And there's no life in them. So as I am forgotten and would be forgotten, so I would forget, thus devoted, concentrated in purpose. And always this desire to be known, to be understood, to be remembered. Just let all of that go. Let it go, because in the long run, that's a part of the false self. And God said, prophesy to the wind only, for only the wind will be taken. Obviously, the notion of the wind, like the lady, is the sign of the eternal spirit, calling deep within that which we might be. So that is the eagle from the previous one, which we'll pick up a little later in the other parts of Ash Wednesday. So what should we hear? What should be wary of hearing on the journey, and what part of us, in terms of the inner life, do we say there be dragons there if we go down that particular path? Because there's always a multiplicity of voices, and often they'll dress themselves in the garments white, but back of it, once peeled aside and exposed, there's a darkness. And so it's to the wind we listen to, and which, of course, in John itself is very important in terms of the Spirit is like the wind itself. And the bones sang chirping. So there is, even in the midst of the desert, when one seems deserted, when seems no place, as it were, the garden has disappeared, there's no water, a person feels has reached the point of depression, grief, in which there seems no hope, no point. In fact, there is still the chirping deep down. There's still potential life. And then what Eliot does, he starts moving us into the tensions or the tightrope that in fact must be walked to understand the mature life. And it's in this, the Lady of Silences calls us, and until we are silent in our journey, we cannot hear the speech of the Lady of Silences. And as that involves the meditative, the contemplative, being taught to sit still, then what is the tightrope that we have to walk? Lady of Silence is calm and distressed. Some people long for calmness, some are distressed. How do we live the tension between calmness and distress and calmness? A difficult tightrope to watch indeed. Some can be drawn down the distress, they lose their calmness. Some are all calm, but in the process they're not dealing with deeper issues in themselves that have to be faced into. So it's a false calmness and distress. Torn and whole. How do we live between the element of being torn internally and yet whole? Sometimes for people the tornness leads to fragmentation, that they not whole. Others purchase wholeness but ignore the tornness deep down. They repress or subordinate. Rose of memory and rose of forgetfulness. Rose, of course, is the great symbol of Christ. The rose of Sharon, the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star. So what should we forget? What is the memory worth recalling? And what are those things we should not forget? And how do we live in the tension between memory and forgetfulness? We're exhausted yet life-giving. So how does one hold in tension the notion of exhaustion, and yet life comes out of that exhaustion? Tensions again. And so Eliot is articulating this tightrope to walk and be wary of falling off one side or the other. And the mature faith journey lives with these imponderable difficulties. Worried yet reposeful. So how does one maintain a position of being in repose and still, and yet legitimate worry at the same time for the struggles and the issues of life? One can be reposed but ignore the hard issues. One can be excessively worried and paralyzed by these worries. Tensions, repose and worry. We find these tensions in the Beatitudes, and in that sense Beatrice is very important because it comes from the Beatitudes, the beatific vision. These are all very central to the unfolding of the human soul in a mature way, just as the rose itself, with petals closed, is like the soul, and gradually as it opens to eternity, the petals open and open, and you have the magnificent beauty of either a rose or a rose garden itself, with its exquisite beauty and its fragrance. Anyone, for example, who's been to Butchart Gardens on the island and goes through the multiple rose gardens, you've entered into a paradise of fragrance and beauty itself. So he goes on to the single rose, which of course is Christ. In any of the cathedrals in Europe, the rose is central to all of that, which is Christ. The single rose is now the garden. So what you have is in Christ, the garden of the soul which has been lost is now increasingly recovered. So Christ brings back to life again the garden in the desert of the soul. Another tension, garden and desert. Desert can lead to the sense of pointlessness, hopelessness, no life, no water, parchness. Why go on? What's the purpose? But there is the garden in the soul, if we have but ears to hear. The single rose is now the garden, where all loves end. And of course, what Eliot is doing here, he's not using "and" as something is over. He's using the Greek notion of telos as fulfillment. Just as an acorn becomes an oak tree, that's its end, that's its purpose, that's its fulfillment. And so he's tapping into the classical notion of an end having a telos. And so the very nature of the journey for humans is often to go through. They have to face through the inferno. They have to burn off that which they are not. Very painful, very difficult. People can feel deserted at that point in their journey. The eclipse of God, the silence of God, the sense of where do they belong. But the end of the burning is, in fact, the new being emerging, the deified self in that sense. So the end, how Eliot is using it, how Dante would understand it, is in fact the fulfillment of who actually we're meant to be in the transformative journey of dying, of burning, and then it's the sifting of the wheat and chaff, the gold from the dross, the fire and the rose in that sense, in terms of how Eliot would understand it. This terminates torment in that sense, of love unsatisfied, because people often live. The torment of who am I, how am I to live, what makes life meaning, and that can lead to sore torment, of love unsatisfied, the greater torment, and then the greater torment, and finally of love satisfied, which the end of the endless, that goes on and on in terms of our process of transformation, which begins in this life if we are open, but continues long after. A journey to no end, conclusion of all that is inconclusible. And then he comes back to, so we've looked at the lady, we've looked at white, now we've come back to the nation of the word. So he says, speech without word. Often there's a lot of speech, but there's not a lot substantively said. People can natter on about things that really don't matter. So you can have speech without word in terms of small w, in which a life-giving word is not given, in which people circle insignificant issues, and even this can be done in an intellectual world in which there is speech, but not really life-giving words given to others. So you have speech without word, and word capital W of no speech. And so even though at one hand there is not verbal speech, obvious speech, in fact, the big W word, or the logos itself, is speaking into, breathing in life into the soul and revigorating it, which is the classical logos, which Eliot will pick up on in 4 quartets. But the word capital W, he's obviously referring to the classical notion of the logos, which St. John will pick up in the beginning with the word ein archeologos in that sense. So grace to the mother. So we're back again to grace mediated. It can be grace mediated through speech. It can be grace mediated through the wind, grace mediated through Our Lady. There's various means if we have the openness to receive that grace itself. Grace to the mother for the garden where all love ends or reaches its fulfillment. And so there's this rebirth, what Eliot is suggesting, pointing to. In fact, it's the garden of the new being. But the final section ends, we're back in the desert again. So this is another tension, the garden and the desert. So he says, under a juniper tree, the bones sang, scattered and shining. So as we return to often our journey in the desert of time, where there seems to be no plants, no water, alone in the desert, where our desires clash with one another, where they're not centered, where they're not at one. We're glad to be scattered at one hand. We did little good to each other. So part of the human journey, where humans can be divided, they can be dissembled, they do little good for one another. So can these goods be brought back together in a much healthier way, in which, as it were, the legs, the kidney, the heart, the mind can be brought together in a unified, mature way in which they do good for one another under the tree. And of course, anytime we get tree, which again we have it 3 times in this section, we're back to the Eden tree, the tree of life. Does the tree of our soul have deep roots? Does it have shallow roots? When the tempest of time comes along, if the roots are shallow, the tree of the soul will be easily blown. So how does the tree of our soul sink down deep roots in terms of desires and longings and thirsts, so the faculties are integrated? So under a tree in the cool of the day with the blessing of sand, one hardly thinks, in fact, sand is a blessing. The desert is a blessing. Garden, yes, we can all relate to beauty, to fragrance, but desert? And it's often, in fact, if we have ears to hear, there's the blessing of the sand, and that takes a certain level of discernment, a certain level of wisdom to see the blessing of the sand in the desert where all is dry and seemingly dead and pointless. Forgetting themselves and each other's, united in the quiet of the desert. So we're back to the desert, and what the desert in terms of life can be a garden if we understand things in a paradoxical way and have the ability to receive that much, much deeper. This is a land which you shall divide by lot, and neither division nor unity matters. This is the land, and this is the inheritance that, in fact, we have to live with. It's not the garden fulfilled. It's not the telos in which the garden all comes together, but the garden is in the soul, but we live in the desert. And this is our inheritance. In fact, this is what we then have to live with on our all too human journey through time. As we'll move on to section 3, Eliot will move from Dante, elements of the Divine Comedy, using images from that and the broader Christian tradition, to the Carmelites and John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, and then the notion going back to the mothers and fathers of the church of the ascent to truth and the staircase, and leaving lower desires behind and what those are like, gradually doing the spiral higher and higher to the divine life, which of course we find in Divine Comedy as Dante unpacks that journey from the Inferno through the Purgatorio to the Paradiso. And so then Dante in many ways anticipates the Carmelite mystics, and he in fact is reflecting the earlier tradition of the ascent to truth itself. And so we'll pick up on that next week when we look at section 3 in Ash Wednesday, as we again unfold how Eliot is understanding what must be left behind, the subtle notions of how we can be distracted, how we can undermine our potential, and then the means of actually positively moving forward in a discerning way on our faith journey.